Long ago, the mighty virgin forests echoed with the sharp crack of the axe, the shouts of the pioneer lumbermen, and the rattle and rustle of chain and harness as the horses strained. Slowly, steadily, they pushed back the borders of wilderness, making way for civilization. These men carved the rugged forests, laying the foundation for the vast woodlands industry that we know today. The logging industry began in the 19th century, with much of the harvesting restricted to white pine, which was abundant, accessible, and very versatile. This early timbering provided an important source of income for the settlers. The first timber to be sold was cordwood for the river steamboats and hand-hewn railroad ties. Another incident helping the expanding timber industry was Napoleon's defeat of Britain at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1806. Due to this loss, Britain's European wood supply was compromised as France denied access to ports and wood products. As a result, Britain turned to Canada to meet their timber needs in construction, railways, and shipbuilding, creating a British North American timber industry. The Ontario government provincial land policies began to open up new farming areas in the north, a goal which was closely linked to timber and lumber operations. Politicians assumed that logging would clear land that could be turned into farms. The homesteaders would be able to supply the lumber camps with food, adding to their income by working as loggers during the long winters when farm activities slowed right down. By the 1850s, this goal was being realized. The outer edges of the forests in northwestern Ontario became an agricultural frontier for Canadian and American farmers, creating homesteads throughout northwestern Ontario. American demand for lumber was another driving force behind northwestern Ontario's move into a forest-dominated economy. In 1898, the Ontario provincial government passed a law prohibiting the export from Ontario of raw, unprocessed pine saw logs. This resulted in American lumber companies building mills in Ontario. As a result, the companies created log camps to house the logging crews. Logging began in the fall when swampers, fellers, and sawyers went into the forest to cut tote roads. The workers were known as beavers because of their peculiar cutting style. A large barge was loaded with all the equipment and supplies required to set up the camp. This included horses, hay, oats, cattle for slaughtering, and also building materials and nails. The men would build a large log bunkhouse or shanty where they lived for the next 6 months. The camp was located near a suitable stand of trees for the winter's cutting. Each camp had bunkhouses, a cook stove with a dining room, a blacksmith shop, a company store, and some stables. A typical camp had 2 large bunkhouses erected about 30 feet apart. They were joined together by a common washroom consisting of a large barrel heater stove beneath a tub of water and some wooden troughs for bathing 50 to 60 dirty, sweaty men. Bunkhouses were capable of sleeping 60 men with double rows of bunks. In the center aisle between the rows of bunks sat the wood stoves, above which were long poles generally laden with wet socks and underwear. There were also tables and benches which the men used for playing cards. In the large cookhouse, there were sleeping accommodations for the cook, the second cook, and the cookies. The bull cooks were the caretakers of the bunkhouses, supplying all needs such as cleaning, firewood, and water. Upon arrival at the camp, each man was issued 5 blankets and a jute sack, which he filled with hay or straw to make his mattress. At mealtimes, when the cookie sounded the bell, the men trooped into the cookhouse. Each man had his own place at the table, and no unnecessary conversation was allowed. The loggers ate typical frontier food. Breakfast included pancakes, syrup, bacon, sausages or ham, coffee, bread, porridge, and CPR strawberries. The loggers had packed lunches with them. Supper for everyone was a repeat of lunch. A good cook was necessary to keep the men happy. The food was good and plentiful. The main controller in the camp was the clerk, who indoctrinated workers to camp life. He ordered all supplies, recorded the amount of wood cut and the amount of pay due to the loggers. Most logging camp workers came from construction or local farms. Agriculturalists worked to create money to supplement their farms. Logging was a hand-me-down trade to apprentices and family members who would start at piling and progress to cross saw or buck saw. Another source of labor for the forest industry was the professional bushworker. These men worked in mills, sawing wood or producing paper in the summertime. The cook was the highest paid worker in the camp, making 3 times the bushworker's monthly wage. The cruiser, who scouted and marked out the winter cut, made $10 a day compared to the cutter's $1. Loggers that worked in the bush could be sure of 2 things: dangerous job conditions and back-breaking work. There were 3 men on a cutting team, 1 axeman and 2 sawyers. The axeman decided on the trees to be cut and the direction each tree should fall, which he then back-cut with his axe. Then the 2 sawyers would stand on opposite ends of the tree with their cross-cut saw. And when the tree fell, men called choppers would trim the branches and mark where it was to be sawed. The sawyers would then cut the wood into 16-foot lengths, adding 6 inches to compensate for transit damage, and finally swampers, who were the lowest paid logger, trimmed the rest of the branches and kept trails open and free. Eventually, the companies opted for one-man teams, increasing the workload on the logger, especially in creating the 4-foot-high pulpwood rows. Logs were cut into long lengths and then skidded to the road. Horses performed this task in either of 2 ways. First, large logs or several smaller ones were chained and their front ends lifted, and the horse would drag it out. The other way was to chain the backs of the logs and to put the fronts on a sled in order to move the logs more easily out to the road. Experienced horsemen arrived a couple of weeks after cutting and piling to start the skidding. All wood had to be on the roadside and ready to be transported by New Year's Day to capitalize on ice conditions. The sleigh haul was a super competitive part of logging. Transport teams had to be very efficient. At night, teams would use horses to pull a tanker filled with water. They would then spray water on the roads to make the roads slippery, allowing the sleigh runners to slide effortlessly across the frozen surfaces. Logs were loaded onto the sleigh using a jammer system. With a tree as the lifting mast and the top loader, the log would be lifted into position on the sleigh and the cable released. Cant hooks were also embedded into the tree to keep it stable during lifting and loading. Swampers used these hooks to move wood from the skid pile to the lifting position onto the horse sled. Safety of the teamsters and their load was monitored en route. Hills were hot-sided to slow the sleigh down, protecting horses and teamsters from injury. On steep hills, cables were used to release the sleds slowly down the hill. When teams arrived at the river, they unloaded the wood to allow easy access come springtime. The lumberjacks pushed the wood into the river and spent most of the day with their peavies. The most dangerous part of the river drive was jam-ups, a problem that could happen very quickly. Drivers had to step on the logs and push and prod them until the jam released. The lumberjack then had to jump to safety to prevent himself from being severely injured or even killed. And such was the life of a river driver. In the years 1896 to 1910, pine production was at 50 million cords annually. In 1913 to 1915, the Ontario lumber industry suffered mill closures and widespread economic failure. While the industry began to regroup in the 1930s, numerous shutdowns and tough economic conditions ensured that the sawmills in Ontario remained relatively small until finally, in the 70s, the demand for Ontario lumber grew and companies opened up much larger mills. By the 1980s, northwestern sawmills were harvesting approximately 20 to 30 million cords of spruce and balsam, as well as 10 million cubic feet of the other species. Along with the development of the lumber sector, there was a growth of pulp and paper mills in northwestern Ontario. The first pulp mill, built in northwestern Ontario, was in 1892 by Francis Clerge. His mill was constructed beside the St. Mary's Rapids in Sault Ste. Marie. By 1901, the Ontario paper industry was well underway. A Department of Lands pamphlet stated that not only has Ontario an almost limitless supply of the right kind of material, but she has also extensive water power and suitable labor. In 1911, Americans reduced tariffs on newsprint, and within 2 years, it was eliminated, benefiting mills in northwestern Ontario. Plants began in Dryden in 1911, Iroquois Falls in 1912, and Smooth Rock Falls in 1918. A new paper machine was also started up in Fort Frances. Newsprint sold for $37 a ton in 1916, $103.50 in 1921, and some areas paid as much as $300 a ton. New mills were constructed in Fort William, Port Arthur, Kapuskasing, and Kenora in hopes of spurring new growth. After World War II, prices for newsprint rose sharply, and by 1948, prices were at their highest in almost 30 years. This led to an upgrade in equipment and new mills, with modern technology moving into the forest industry. After the war, northwestern Ontario's newsprint capacity rose by 49%. Injuries and fatalities in bush camps were almost an epidemic, as there were no safety structures implemented, unlike the sawmills and pulp and paper mills, which had in-house safety programs. Around 1900, there was a big push to improve conditions in logging camps, with unions spearheading the movement, negotiating for higher wages, benefits, and safer, more tolerable conditions in the forest industry. After World War II, companies formed committees to study living conditions in the camps. They came back with recommendations that would humanize the camps. For instance, companies decided that they would prefabricate the camp, making it portable and renewable. To reduce costs, it was decided that there would be one central camp for the crews, and that each crew would be transported to and from their camps to the cutting area each and every day. By the early 50s, camp conditions had improved significantly. In 1958, Marathon Paper became the first company to build camps with two-man rooms and individual lockers. Another area of emphasis was the development of healthy and nutritious meals for the hardworking loggers. Cafeterias were contracted to outside services and became a more economical way of feeding the workers. Finally, around this time, companies began building family houses in or near camps, and this proved very successful. Men became more productive, and it was a lot cheaper to care for their families. After World War II, wood accessibility and labor shortages challenged the forest industry. Government made it mandatory to utilize all wood species. Immigration helped ease some of the labor shortages. Eligible immigrant workers signed a contract with forest companies for a period of 12 months, at the end of which they could leave and work wherever they wanted. After 5 years, they would become eligible for Canadian citizenship. Most workers could not handle the lumber camps, and about half quit after the first couple of days. Hardly any immigrants wanted to work in the pulp and paper industry, preferring instead to work in factories and mines. At the same time, farms began to shrink and labor was lost from the agricultural sector. The lack of workers increased the wages and benefits of the loggers. Change and improvement increased the cost of extracting a tree from the bush and hauling it to the mills. As a result, companies began to experiment with technology as a way to lower costs and increase productivity. An important technological advancement in the logging industry was the introduction of steam power used in the operation of some logging equipment. The first use was the warping tug, a square-nosed scow which had a powerful steam engine driving its working winch. Steam also began to infiltrate the camps in rail loaders and made many of the back-breaking jobs much, much easier. The most popular was a steam train used by Abitibi at Iroquois Falls Mill. They had 2 locomotives and could pull 28 flat cars with 16 cords in each car. Following steam, the gasoline engine was introduced in northern Ontario. Then companies such as Caterpillar, Ford, and International Harvester began manufacturing tractors. The addition of mechanized equipment meant fewer workers, but didn't reduce danger around the workplace. Quite the opposite. Skilled operators were in high demand and frustratingly hard to find. Motorized trucks were used to deliver supplies. Eventually, wood-hauling trucks were invented. A Packard truck, for instance, was used by the Hope Lumber Company to move supplies and could haul 4-ton loads at a speed of 4 to 5 miles per hour. In the 1930s, the practice of using trucks to pull sleighs was introduced, as was the diesel engine, which became commonplace in camps by the end of the decade. Chainsaws were also something the companies wanted to experiment with. In the beginning, there was a 2-man chainsaw available, but it was cumbersome and unreliable. In 1945, Industrial Engineering out of British Columbia developed a single-operator chainsaw called the Beaver. The testing of the Beaver was disappointing. The carburetor was designed so you could only cut straight, with stalling occurring when cutting upside down. In the years that followed, improvements in carburation and the use of lighter metals made the chainsaw available in the forest industry. Men purchased saws at a price of $200 to $400 each because it made the job a lot easier and increased individual productions by 30%, resulting in better wages. Up until 1951, the horse was still the main method of skidding wood. A mechanical skidder was needed, but early designs based on the dozer created maintenance problems with the tracks. Forest companies combined and financed a design that would work in northwestern Ontario forests, a design which is still prevalent in today's skidders. The skidder that made the most impact on the logging industry was the tree farmer. This machine was a center-turning articulate steering skidder developed and built in Woodstock, Ontario by Robert Simmons, a logger, and Wes McGill, a salesman, in 1960. Kimberly Clark estimated that the switch from horses to the tree farmer saved $2.05 per cord on production cost, a 7% savings. The skidder was used as a model for logging all over the world. In 1966, the Technical Commission of the World Forestry Congress reported that Ontario operators had led the way by example and given Ontario logging equipment manufacturers a lead on the competition. By this time, Ontario's manufactured equipment was skidding logs in the USA, South America, and Africa. Technology changed the way work was done in the logging industry. The pace of cutting was no longer dictated by the cutter. Instead, it was controlled by the efficiency and speed of the machine. In the 1970s, the harvester operators cut approximately 125 trees an hour. The mechanization of wood harvesting was embraced by the Northwestern Ontarian. The unions believed in technology, and the loggers saw it as a way to make their jobs easier. In a sense, technology was the great equalizer. Previously, jobs like cook, blacksmith, and teamsters paid up to 250% more than the cutters or other less skilled positions in the logging camp. But the gap in wages between skilled and unskilled workers was narrowed dramatically, with the highest paid workers, the welder, mechanic, and carpenter, making $12.50 per hour, and the laborer at $10.01 per hour, a differential of only $2.57. Up until the mid-50s, camps were company-owned and operated. Companies wanted to contract out owner-operating to individuals, paying higher piecework as incentive to attract contractors. Unions vehemently opposed owner-operator and fought it through collective agreements and threats of strike. In 1959, unions agreed that workers with their own skidders and other such equipment could work independently for the company. The union had the understanding that when these individuals retired, their jobs would revert to the company. In 1978, this was challenged by Boise Cascade, who had purchased Ontario and Minnesota Pulp and Paper. Boise wanted some independent operators in the Fort Frances area, offering some operators the right to purchase company skidders to operate independently of the union. Boise claimed this was the only solution to high harvesting costs in northwestern Ontario, the highest in the country, and the only way they could guarantee profits in the future. Boise's economic dominance of the Fort Francis-Kenora area, paired with the 1959 agreement to allow owner-operators in the area, gave Boise reason to challenge this work practice and to introduce the owner-operator system. This action created a backlash of anger and rage within the forestry union, lumber and saw. Boise woodworkers began walking off the job on July 5, 1978. Soon 140 workers were on strike, and Boise's woodland operations were at a standstill. Kenora woodworkers joined the strike in October of 1978. Boise petitioned the Ontario government to declare the strike illegal, while the union contended it was a lockout. The government ruled that it was an illegal strike. The union chose to ignore the back-to-work order. The company filed contempt charges against 100 of the strikers, who were found guilty and fined $50 each and $25 for each day they remained on strike. The paper industry saw great advancements in computer and mechanical technology. The Woodlands division of most forest companies was contracted out, resulting in a lot of mom-and-pop logging operations. Towns and communities all over northwestern Ontario became dependent on sawmills and pulp and paper mills to earn their living. The forest industry represented quite a substantial portion of northwestern Ontario's economic growth and stability. Machinery and harvesting procedures changed in the latter half of the 20th century. More mechanized harvesting made for greater yields and profits for forest companies. Environmentalists challenged wood-cutting practices of the industry, making way for more sensitive wood-cutting practices and systems of reforestation to ensure forest futures. In the late 80s, huge paper machines were constructed all over the US and Canada, creating an overabundance of paper, and the price of paper began to slowly decline. In the lumber sector, competition was keeping lumber prices low, making profitability harder. In the late 90s and into the 21st century, the bottom began to drop out of the forest industry. Newsprint mills began shutting down all over Canada and the US. Lumber products began to fluctuate in price. Trade disputes between Canada and the US over softwood lumber resulted in the Canadian lumber sector experiencing problems in transporting their product into the US market. Mill closures in the 2004 to 2006 period made northwestern Ontario very vulnerable to economic collapse. Forestry has always been a way of life for people in northwestern Ontario. It has been a great economic mainstay for a lot of years. There's a lot of uncertainty today about the future of logging. However, one only has to look at the continuous need for building supplies and paper to realize northwestern Ontario is in position with great resources and workers to carve their future again in the way of the logger.